Well, a very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. We're starting punctually in the third show in the Bauhaus reuse to the topic of quality of the city. And as you know, and our translator's a little bit too loud, I'm sorry for that, ladies and gentlemen. And this year, as you know, we start with an introduction of the topic in which we take the time to talk about one or two of the terms and introduce you to the terms, and then at 7 p.m. we shall start with the actual discussion. And today we have a different constellation. After the second two times we had panel discussions with several guests. Today we have a format here where we can present you with two texts of our guests, and then we're going to have a little conversation with me moderating that as your host. And I shall introduce you to our guests here, first in brief and then later on in detail. My name is Robert Huber. I'm of Zukunftsgeraeusche, which translates as Sounds of the Future. We're an office in Munich and Berlin. And I may say that we are responsible for this very beautiful building we're in, Bauhaus Reuse. And with this information, I shall mention the cooperation partners of this evening. First of all, this is the Bauhaus, the Museum of Design and the Architectural Chamber of Berlin, and the Competence Center Großsiedlung and the Technical University Berlin. And there, in detail, the section of Sociology, the Institute of Sociology, and our sponsor this year, thank you so much, for the Federal Agency of Civic Education. You might hear it later on when we come to the main section of this evening. On my right-hand side, on your left-hand side, there is Marianne Rodenstein of the University in Frankfurt. As a brief introduction, I shall introduce her more in detail later on. And on the other side, there is Mr. Uwe Wirth, whom I'm going to introduce you to in detail later on. Mr. Wirth is a professor for New German Literature at the University of Gießen, and Ms. Rodenstein is a sociologist. She is not active anymore in that area. That was just a short biography. Well, this evening is going to be scheduled in a way that, first of all, we're going to introduce you to the term of performativity, which connects to the civic society, the urban society, and how it evolved. Of course, we're not the first to deal with that topic, but Frau Rodenstein is an expert of analyzing the principles of our subject here. And as you know, we have 5 shows in this series, each of which is specifying on one aspect of urban society. And besides the term of performativity, we're also going to talk about the term of urban society or civic society. We're using that term on an everyday basis almost, but we're going to learn more about this term in depth. Well, these are my introductory words to this evening. And then let's start with the introduction. Not ladies first, but due to the subject, we're going to start with Mr. Wirth, as we prepared it. The second lecture of John L. Austin, you might be familiar with that. If you have been here for the introduction, you have a copy of that already. And if you have learned about the text, very good. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. We have a lot of time for questions. We're going to go through the introduction and brief. But should you have like an important question, if there's something you don't understand, because it's very important for us to introduce you to the term properly, then please feel free to ask that question. Mr. Wirt, I shall hand over the word to you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this introduction. Was that the sound check? Oh, yeah, it's perfect. Thank you so much. Well, the way we thought it would go, and later on I'm going to talk about, for 30 minutes, about performativity, about this urban society and its connection. I don't want to take too much room about talking about performativity. Maybe we're going to deal with that for 15 minutes now. And then later on I shall hand over the word to you so we can talk about the term of urban society, of civic society. Well, it's almost a kind of seminar that we're having here. We're starting here already. Let's go straight away. I wanted to ask you, have you heard of the term of performativity? Anybody here who had to deal with that subject? Nobody? Okay, it's first contact with the term. Very good. Well, let's make a question and answer game. A little seminar here. You all have your scripts here. Have you? As you can see, it's an anthology which I actually published to the term of performativity. As was mentioned before, I studied philosophy. I'm a professor for literature and also deal with cultural theory. And this book actually came into existence because my colleagues approached me and they said, use the term performance in order to actually confuse their colleagues. And I studied in the United States, and I also studied with Habermas in Frankfurt. And I said, come on, let's use that term correctly. And there's like different aspects to the term performativity. And we're going to talk about performance. Performativity was Erika Fischer-Lichte who made that term more popular here in Germany. And in her way of using that term, I would actually like, together with you, have a look in that very famous second lecture of Austin. Well, let's have like 3 or 4 prominent quotes of this text, and we're going to talk about this later on. If you have never heard this term before and then you think, oh my God, what is this actually? If you have a look at how this starts, it's the second lecture. John Austin is a professor of philosophy in Oxford, and he deals in depth with Wittgenstein. He's the publisher of Frege in Germany. And he's a philosopher of language, and he's dealing with one question: how do we deal with language? If actually it is our key to the world, to reality, and how can we tell what's right about the world, what's wrong about the world? And there's a class of, Wittgenstein would have said, word plays actually, that don't work with the functional scheme of right or wrong, cannot be judged in these terms, right and wrong. For example, I'm not going to talk about more than 10 minutes about the term of performativity, and the pro seminar is going to be closed. Things like this, for example. Or questions can come up with, has Trump declared the war of somebody by annoying somebody, or was it just annoying somebody? So these are questions that arise in the act of speaking. There is an institutional power, institutional impact when we deal with language, when we use that. And we're dealing with language, with speaking acts, as you could call them, on a daily basis. For example, when I say, it is cold, and I want to tell you, turn on the heating. But turn on the heating would be a very direct way, an explicit way of saying, and an indirect act of speaking would be saying, oh, it is cold in here. And this is about the idea that Austin develops here. And he's very humorous, which you can actually tell in his second lecture. It's a typical British professor. He's so cool. He comes from the depth of the room. He deals with the philosophy of language, but then he has no problem whatsoever to come up with contradiction. For example, he says, what I did in the last lecture was complete crap. Okay, let's start completely anew. And I really admire this professor. He's a fantastic professor. Have a look at the first two sentences. First of all, as you remember, there was a first lecture. As you remember, we wanted to deal with a couple of cases where saying something means actually doing something, where it means we do something by saying something. And if you want, this is the speaking act theory. By uttering a word or a formula or a term, you actually decide on something. You come up with an obligation after you said this. We could play with this a little more. For example, if we go to page 64, he deals with the question, how is it actually I hereby declare war, or I hereby declare the seating to be opened? Who is actually allowed to do that? And what do I have to be, or what do I have to have done so that people actually follow me when I come up with an order? Or that people actually believe that when I say yes in front of the altar in a marriage situation that I actually mean it. How can I tell I really mean it? So these are the conditions of a successful speaking act. And on page 2 you can actually see, if you have a look in the middle of the page, on page 64, on the first half, it's about the fitting circumstances, the term that he uses. We need these circumstances to persuade us. So, for example, when do people believe us? You know, British people like to bet a lot, that actually a bet has come into existence. For example, I would have to say, do you want to place a bet with me? Do you want to bet against me that I'm going to stop talking in 5 minutes? No. Damn. What's your bet? Come up with a bet. Don't say we're going to bet about nothing. What do you want to bet about? Some money. The British take a bet on what's going to be the name of the next child of Meghan Markle. What would be the next name? Harry, for example? Okay, let's place a bet here. And we'd say, right, we have a deal here, this is a bet. And what are we going to bet on? For example, it could be €5. Yes, that does make sense to me. Well, I would bet 10. Okay, let's stick to €5. And the question, okay, first of all, we have established a bet now. And now the bookmakers would have to come up with a quote. Well, that was a silly bet of mine. It's very unlikely that this kid would be named Harry. But now we have this bet, and then at the end, when the child is born, you have to pay, for example. If you, well, it could be that your €5 you have to pay turn into 50,000 euros if you deal with the Moldavians mafia or something. Well, this is the idea that Austin deals with. If after a speaking act there is the consequences of it, there's consequences of what you said, and you have to do something about it. You have to bear, you have to live with these consequences. But the initial start is the speaking act. Well, he says, in order to convince us of that, for example, if you place a bet after the race has started, it's not good anymore, it's not valid, you can't place a bet. Well, you can actually say that, but this is not the only condition you need in order to succeed with that bet. And these conditions actually for the speaking act ending happily or successfully is quite an ironic neologism that he introduces to get away from the usual language philosophical terminology. So this is his basic idea, and you can see that when you actually go through these pages. For example, at page 65, there's a rather odd thing, gamma 1, gamma 2, B1, B2. That's the way he deals with these things. This is his typical approach. We're not going to follow him on that. What he does, what is actually very interesting to see, I told you he's got a lot of humor. Well, he is asking about the terms of succeeding from the negative side. He asks, what can actually go wrong after the speaking act? For example, why cannot marry a donkey? Why cannot marry a donkey to make fun of the institution of marriage? I would actually do that if I would be able to marry a donkey. So I would make fun of these institutions. And could there be many infelicities? Could there be several scenarios of things going wrong at the very same time? For example, you could promise a donkey of giving him a carrot, but not meaning it. Well, apart from the fact that a donkey would never understand you, of course, you don't actually mean it. And this is his way of thinking about how speaking acts can actually succeed or fail. And so we come back to the term of performativity. And there's two very interesting ways of not succeeding. For example, the abuse of speaking acts. If I want to betray you and promise you something, this is a promissive speaking act, but I don't actually mean it. You see, that meaning, actually, what you're saying is very important here in this context. And second, which can actually start a very long debate, when you think of Derrida and his postmodern ways of dealing with language, is what if I quote a speaking act? For example, if I marry on a theater stage, then the marriage is not valid anymore because it's like a quote. I quote the word of saying yes. So there's actually several conditions where the speaking act has no validity. For example, if you're in front of court in the name of the people or by the power that has been given to me. So you see, quoting speaking acts is very important because it can actually lack power. The power can be taken away of the speaking act, even though you use the very same words. And on page 70, Austin uses a very it's very, very interesting here because it took him 10 years of thinking about it, and the deconstructive literature philosophy dealt about it for a decade. And we, as experts and scientists of literature, we don't want to deal with words that mean something. We also want to have an impact. And you can only be important if you have an institutional power. And here on page 70, and performative utterings cannot actually mean what they say if it's a quote, for example, on the theater stage, or when it's a poem, or if you say something to yourself. So it can be a completely change of settings, a completely change of the scene. In this English, it says sea change. That's the term, and he uses that very ironically because there's a connection where the term sea change is used in Shakespeare's The Storm. And the joke actually is that joke says about taking the power away of speaking acts. That's what he deals about it. And then he uses terminology that only came into existence in literature. So this is a very special way of dealing with the language that comes in a very nebulous way, is lacking power. There is a parasite aspect to power too. For example, if you mean something ironically, if you quote it, then you could actually say you're using the word in a parasite way. Derrida, for example, used the metaphor of putting something onto it, like where you put a branch on a tree by in order to take its power of it. So that was our 5-minute soup of performativity, the whole theory of performativity in 7.5 minutes. Mr. Wirth, thank you so much. That was the background of the term you described here. And of course, that was almost the whole performativity theory in 5 minutes. And later on, we're going to hear more about you, where you apply that term in the evolution of the city. What we've learned apart from that term is that Mr. Böhmermann, the German satirist, could have said, using Austin, that this is just a quote and I don't mean it and cannot be sued for that. You might actually know that case through the German press. Okay, let's go away from the performativity, from that subject, and come up with another subject with a term that we use on a regular basis here, that we also use as the title here for our evenings: the performativity of the city, emancipation and integration in the urban society. And in a lot of works, this has been dealt with: the urban society. This is the subject here. And when we talk about the construction of terms, then consequently we should actually connect it to the term of urban society. Well, initially I was not thinking about it, that we have to analyze this term, because I'm so familiar with that from the time of my studies on. And I was actually glad you indicated how important this is, and you sent me a wonderful text about it, and I found it very enlightening. And I actually would want to hand over the word to you now, so you can actually give us some in-depth analysis of this term. Thank you so much for your introduction, Mr. Wirth. I found it very interesting, like sifting through the nebula here, so to speak. Well, for me, it all started my dealing with these subjects. For example, when I was reading the paper in the morning, I found this term on and on again, urban society. It was used more and more often. And me, as a sociologist, I know that these things don't connect: urban society and performativity and the urban society. Partly, the city means it's ruled by society, and part of it is also owned by society. As a sociologist, sociological term, or as a terms of analysis, if you ask me, you cannot use that term, really. It makes no sense. And I was wondering, what could it actually mean, so that I don't have to get upset on it anymore. And I thought, if we use the term urban society, then we have to analyze it in a performative way as an act. When you give this label urban society, it actually brings into existence, or shall be brought into existence, the actual urban society itself. When a speaker says urban society, then in others the imagination comes into being that there actually is a society with a common frame, and this common frame is not the nation, is not the state, but the city. Hence the urban society. But what is the sense about it? What is the similarities? What is the frame? That's for everybody to guess by themselves. And the question that arose for me is, what reality is being established by using that term. And then I was sifting through archives, newspaper archives, and also reading different authors in order to find out how did this term come into existence. So I have two little results. The career of this term started in the 1990s. In 1993, there was an online archive of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung established, and in that very year you have 3 articles in the feuilleton, in the cultural section of the newspaper, dealing with urban society, 2 of which were about the architectural historian Michael Mönninger and the city planner Dieter Hoffmann-Abstern. And these 2 persons played a great role in distributing that term, in making it more popular. When I started actually dealing with that term, that was in the year 2012, in October. Up to that time, in this very year, there were 523 uses of the term urban society in the FAZ archive, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung archive. First of all, this term came into being in the cultural section and later on went to the local section, not only in Berlin, but also in Munich, in Dortmund, in Berlin, in Stuttgart. It's present everywhere in this term of urban society, least often, actually, which is funny to know. In Hamburg, in 1993, there's the book Urban Stadt, the urban city, where this term was used. And after a conference in 1999 in the Surkamp publishing company, there was a book also dealing with that term. And Mr. Hoffmann-Abstern actually insisted on that very title of the urban society. And then in fast concession, Hansmann Anhut in the year 2000, the Threatened City Society, Threatened Urban Society was published, and then more and more books were published where migration plays a role, the migrants. So we can actually take it for granted, or can actually conclude that in the last 25 years, through all these conferences and usage in the newspapers, and also through the use of politicians and the scientists dealing with the involvement of the city. And it was actually an oscillation between the scientific speech and the everyday speak, and of course the meaning of this word changes. And how it came into being in detail, I was not actually able to conclude. And then I dealt with the context in which this term came about. And there's 3 contexts here. The first context is Urban Society 1, which is actually the roof over the city and all its different aspects and its diversity. Number 2 means the whole society of the city, and we don't have a specification of actually what holds these people together. That's the meaning of the word that came into existence, or was actually cleared, that in the mid-90s. And in 1992, there was 2 cities in East and West, and it was actually a fear that these 2 parts of the cities could evolve in a different way. So we have this term that's actually like a roof of the diversity of the city. Urban city is actually what the rulers of the city feel responsible for, the people who plan the city, who make it work. And what it actually means is we all are a part of that city, but people living around that city are not a part of it. So it's a political fragmentation in the use of that term. And what sociology analyzes finds actually a mirroring in this, in the using of the language, which actually is a political problem too. So this term is used for a connection of the society of a city that's defragmented, that could actually fall apart. And there is aspects where you can say there is a flat society with a periphery, and we're talking about being a part of the middle of the society. For example, Muslims in Frankfurt asked for being a part of the middle of this society. And the second term that I could find very distinctively, and for which I give you the example of Christian Ude, who in 1993, when he was introducing the program of the Social Democrat Party of Germany, he said he wanted an urban society with solidarity as opposed to a society that fights each other and that falls apart. And it goes on from there. There's a lot of people who wish for a social urban society, or people working more together as in the society. And in this example, we're asking about the possibility of identification with that urban society. And it does not mean actually the expectancy of the people using that term. And the third meaning of the term is now something really different, because as urban societies, sometimes just a portion of society is meant. And a new term comes into existence, which actually deals with certain parts of society and or certain bodies within that society. And these bodies or people meet to deal with certain aspects. So we're talking about certain parts of society, and they're not migrants or poor or rich, like in the first use of that term, but also because in a way that they are influential and try to bring the city forward. For example, there is examples from the city of Frankfurt, for example, the Opera Ball in Frankfurt, or the new Altstadt building project, or when they said goodbye to the mayor, then the whole Stadtgesellschaft, the urban society, came together there. And the Oberbürgermeisterin, the chief mayor of Frankfurt, said the whole Frankfurt actually congregated there. But there was only like 1,000 people there who met in different constellations, who meet in different constellations to deal with public aspects. And they not only come from Frankfurt, but also from around Frankfurt. So this usage of the term is something exclusive. It includes some of the people. It's not an elite of power that we're talking about, but it's more like a new social body that is constituted actually by politics itself, by the rituals of acceptance, you could call them, for people who foster the city in a certain way. If you have a look about this more in depth, you could actually see a hierarchy of acceptance. For example, people who pay for public projects, cultural projects, and so on. So let's bring this together. I have found out that the term of the urban society as it is used today is ambivalent in variant 1. We're talking about the whole society, of the city that is held together by some imaginary reasons. And in the variation 2, we're talking about a normative aspect where you can say that this is a cohesive way of bringing society together by values, by norms. These two variants deal with the connectivity of the society, but variant 3, you have people who actually deal with the problems of the city in a successful way and contribute to the connectivity of the people that was first imaginary becomes actually a factic, a real one. So what does this mean? So there is a hypothesis I actually see here when we're dealing about how the term urban society comes into being. Let's say doing Stadtgesellschaft could be a new way of practice that in some cities from the 90s on evolved and came to here up to this very date. And you could think that there is a fiction of the urban society, and you want, with this fiction, you want to actually counter or fight the diversity of the city, the fragmentation of the city, and you want to come up with something normative that brings people together, that is a common frame. Thank you so much. Thanks for the reflection on the term of urban society. What's so important that we can take from that is that urban society, the meaning of the term is it depends on the people who actually use the term, of their very intentions and on the integration or what part of the city they belong to. What does this urban society offer the person who lives in that city, for example? Is another question here. We dealt about with this question before a little bit, and it all depends on these aspects here. Okay, so much for our introduction now. We're very good in our schedule here. I'm glad about that. Let's make a little break here of 10 minutes. And our next section shall be the main part of this evening, where we're going to have 2 lectures dealing with the title of today's show here. The first should be Performativity of the City. I was asking you if there's like a specific title I should use. No, so there's a little improvised title. Well, I just said Stadtluft macht frei, which translates as city air makes free. Yeah, that's perfect. Excellent, thank you. We shall start with this. This shall be our first impulse here, our first lecture, and later on there's going to be another impulse lecture on the development of the principle on the term of emancipation under the title. Where is the title? Just a sec. I wrote it down. Emancipation, the development of the city, and the freedoms that cities offer. So that's our break here. You can ask questions, for example. And this evening is going to be recorded live, so you have to know that, ladies and gentlemen. 2 questions. The microphone, please. Well, you gave us examples that are really speculative, for example, like war. Like you said before, I declare war. Do I declare war actually, or do I just say it, or if I say yes in front of the altar? Is that also valid for normal acts of speaking? For example, when I say I go now. And when I just stand up and I translate what I said in an action, but the door is closed and I can't get out. Well, is that still valid for these very trivial acts? Oh, yes, absolutely. War, of course, it's a very big example. No, we don't want to think about it in depth. When we're not in a position on a personal level on declaring war on anybody, well, if there's your neighbor nagging you, you declare war on him. That's just metaphorically speaking. Well, marriage is not quite that speculative, even though I'm not married. Maybe I lean out of the window, but when I sit, well, at the latest, at the very next morning after you got married, you woke up and you realized, oh, I don't need to pay that much tax anymore. It's not so speculative. So, but when you say, please open the door, I want to go now, then you give me a direct speaking act. You ask me to do something. It's very trivial, it's banal, but it's still just as valid. Performativity is a big word that could actually make you think twice, but it's a very simple term, actually, because we do it on a daily basis. And the second thing I wanted to ask you, actually, is we're talking about this act of speaking, but also when we're talking about the semiotics of a figure, of a character, the perception of how I dressed, how I talk. Well, you're going right in the center of the performativity theory when we start with the term that Austin developed, performativity, and you're thinking of, well, if I give the order, if I declare war, is that it all, or is that also a performance aspect to it? For example, is my T-shirt, or what's written on my T-shirt, is that part of the statement I give? Or could that be actually a frame? Well, there's acts of speaking, for example, that bring up a real honest feeling, a condolence, for example, when you're in a grave. Of course, if there's something wrong written on your T-shirt, that doesn't make any sense for the act of speaking. So also the way you're dressed is also part of the performative act and can be equivalent to the actual speaker. That's absolutely right there. So you passed the audition. Thank you. You have another question here? Well, what I told you about, without knowing all the theories, without even knowing Austin, what is your judgment on that? How would you actually put this in your act of speaking theory? Just what I did, the term I dealt with, my analysis of the term. Well, I don't know if there's a term that Austin would come up with. That's a declaratory act of speaking, I would say. For example, if you have the power to coin a term, to give birth to a new term, that's a common thing in the frame of science, but also in the frame of politics. In politics, you're often very happy when you come up with a term that everybody takes over and starts using. For example, performativity, Austin and Ms. Frischer-Lichte managed to do just that, to make this term big. But you dealt with the term of urban society, and you said that this one gentleman made politics with that by forcing or making Zukunft, the publisher, using that very term in the title. Well, of course, it always helps. So when you know somebody in the publishing house, for example, if you would say, if you don't use that term in the title, I'm not going to publish my next book, is in your publishing house. A threat is a way of promising something. It's a negative promise. And you often have that in political connection, there are several speaking acts that sound sometimes are very indirectly, but can also be brutal, can be very direct. And yes, this is also another example of the act of speaking, of coining the certain terms and giving birth to them. They can be very dominant, and there's also terms that can actually not make it to the top, even though they can be really great. They're not successful. And of course, if there's the institutional aspect, you deal with power. It's the in-your-face power that some people can have to bring up a term. We're going to talk about that a little later, and I would like to say something about your question too. Instinctively, you led to an aspect that we're going to deal with later. We're going to talk about this actually constitution or the consequence of that act of speaking. For example, if the priest says, I hereby declare you husband and wife, then he brought this marriage into existence. And if I, as an individual, says, from today on I'm going to be this and this, then I constituted something and brought something into existence. And the question is, under which circumstances can I actually do that? Can I do that somewhere on the countryside, on the village, where I live with like 3, 4, 5, 20 people that I know? When I tell them from today on I don't know, I'm this and that, then it's going to be questioned. I will not succeed with that because the circumstances, as often described, are not given. For example, if there is something, if you're in a different surrounding, for example, it might be altogether coming back to the urban society. I actually might succeed with the very same act of speaking because the circumstances are just right. And in this ubiquity that we use the terms, that makes it so interesting. The consequences depending on the surroundings of our society. Now you give me a critical look. Was I misleading here? Oh, that's very interesting what you're saying here. I'm not used to that. Thank you so much. I'm really happy about that. Thank you. Well, please, now my speaking act now is we have a 10-minute break, ladies and gentlemen. See you in a couple of minutes, and my invitation is have a drink if you feel like it. We have soft drinks here for you. And let's say we're going to meet again in 15 minutes here, and there is information. Miss Fischer-Lichte, which we expected here, but we have to excuse her. Well, there's personal circumstances that made her impossible to show up here. Well, thank you so much for now to our two guests. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being part of that introduction. Talk to you in a couple of minutes.